Hello, I'm Stuart Craner. Welcome to this series of webinars brought to you by the Business Ecosystem Alliance. Our aim with the Alliance is to further knowledge of the ideas behind and the best practice of business ecosystems. In this session, we are joined by Elizabeth Altman and David Kiron. Liz is an Associate Professor of Management at the Manning School of Business at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. David is the Editorial Director of Research at the MIT Sloan Management Review. They are 50% of the authors of Workforce Ecosystems, which came out earlier this year. Liz and David argue that as technology enables new, more efficient forms of working and roles become more project and outcomes-based, workforces are evolving into workforce ecosystems, requiring updated strategies, leadership, and management practices. So it should be a really interesting conversation. Before we start, welcome to you all who have joined us live. Please send in any comments, queries, insights, questions at any time during the session. Liz and David are going to present their ideas, and then there'll be time for questions. So Liz and Dave, welcome. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Stuart. What a great opportunity you've given us to present our research to your audience. This research that Liz and I have been working on in collaboration with some colleagues at Deloitte has been going on for 4 years, and as part of a long-standing relationship MIT Sloan Management Review has had with Deloitte for actually more than a decade. It's a unique kind of partnership where my group at SMR partners with a guest editor from academia, and now we've had 3 of them working with Deloitte. I mean, Liz is the most favorite one, of course, and the colleagues from Deloitte have also turned over and changed. And we've been working with Robin Jones, who's a leader in their human capital practice, and Jeff Schwartz, who actually just retired from Deloitte and has moved on to a senior management role at Gloat. So we've been very fortunate to have some great, wise, and really intellectually stimulating colleagues in conducting research on workforce trends, and specifically around the future of the workforce. And this actually started, the future of the workforce, at a period of time when it was really unclear what any kind of future looked like. We started with looking at talent marketplaces, and that was like a emerging phenomena at that time in 2019, and then we broadened it to look at external workers and how that's playing out. So what we're going to be talking about today is the research that we've done, like how we've done it, the findings that we've done, some of the key findings that we found, and the conceptual framework that we developed to address some of the key problems that we identify, and then talk a little bit about what can be done for both business and also policymakers, because there are significant policy implications from some of these workforce trends that we've identified. So most recently, I don't even know if it's most recently, we've produced so much content in this work stream. We produced a book on workforce ecosystems that was recently published by MIT Press in April. And the title of that is Workforce Ecosystem, Achieving Strategic Goals with People, Processes, and Partners. So, Liz, I don't know if you're able to share your screen, but I'm going to turn it over to Liz to talk a little bit about how this research started, and then we'll get into the findings.
Great. Thanks, David. So before we switch to the slides, I think, let me just say, Stuart, and to your team, thank you very much again for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. So David mentioned I'm the third in the series of guest editors, and I like to tell the story very briefly that he sent me an email in, I think it was around the second week of March 2020. So at the time, we really had no idea what was in front of us. And the email said, basically, since David David's name is often on emails that go out for research, but this one said, we know who you are. This is not spam. We know your advisor, Mike Tushman. I think that was the key secret word. So I'd know the email. And we want to talk to you about the future of the workforce. And I did my homework a little bit. And when we got on the phone, I said, look, we think we have a little bit of an issue here. I've read your research, fabulous research, but it really is about inside of an organization. It's very HR centric. It's about how the organization works. And I study strategy and platforms and ecosystems. So I study these connections between organizations and really spanning organizational boundaries. So I think if you're really interested in the future of the workforce in terms of kind of from an HR perspective, then I'm probably not the right person. But in fact, David, I think very insightfully said, look, the team knows exactly who you are and what you're doing. And we want to take this conversation beyond inside an organization. And we want to move it to an ecosystem like conversation. And I mentioned this story because it really is fundamental for how we now think about the workforce and how we eventually developed this concept called workforce ecosystems that we're going to talk with you about today. And so as David mentioned, we published this book called Workforce Ecosystems. I see David has 3 or 4 of them right behind him, I think, just to make the point, which is great. And so we will go through a little more of the research that is in the book. And so if I may, I'm going to continue here and say, okay, when we started this conversation, David said future of the workforce. I said, great, future of the workforce. And then I realized that we really should think about what do we mean by a workforce. And we started to have these conversations. And because we had access, wait, I did not do that. There we go. I want to leave it here for a moment. So because it was MIT and because it was Deloitte, and I had some connections myself, we had access to amazing people who we were talking to. So we spoke to the head of HR for, I'm not quite sure why it does it. Okay. I'm not quite, we spoke to the head of HR at Walmart. We spoke to the head of consumer businesses from Amazon. We spoke to the Mayo Clinic, NASA, et cetera. And inevitably, as we had these conversations, I said, when I say workforce, what do you think of? And I was a little afraid when I first started asking the question that people would say, oh, that's too simple a question, or kind of, why are you asking this question? And it turns out it is a more complex question. And by and large, people would say, oh, we were just thinking about that. Or, this is getting more and more complicated. So of course it's employees, which in the US, we consider W-2 employees, permanent hires. Around the world, it's just those who have been hired permanently, and you would need to lay them off or fire them to have them leave. So they're not by contract, and they're either part-time or full-time. They're also contractors, freelancers, and gig workers. These have always been part of a workforce, but these days we see the number is close to 30 to 50% of a workforce. So it's a very large, starting to become a larger and larger proportion of the workforce. And it's not only lower end, kind of less skilled contributors, but it's also could be part-time CEO, a part-time CFO, data scientists, very highly skilled people who are involved. It's not only individuals, it's also organizations. For example, subcontractors. This is a photo of Amazon Prime delivery trucks. When Amazon decided that they were no longer going to use primarily FedEx, UPS, DHL, they, instead of hiring a whole network of delivery people, they went out and built a subcontractor network. So that's part of their system. Complementary businesses like app developers. These days, for example, if you have a smartphone, you might have Spotify on it, you might have any other streaming app. Those apps were not built by Apple necessarily, nor by the company, nor by Android or the company that makes the operating system. So those developers who create that app aren't your employees, and they're not a supplier to the main firm. They're complementers or accessory providers, but the product or service wouldn't be as good without them. and thus we consider them part of this workforce ecosystem. Similarly, Amazon, for example, or any marketplace around the world, the sellers aren't suppliers and they don't work for the company, but the company couldn't offer the service without them. They are part of the platform, they are part of an ecosystem, and thus they contribute to the value being created, and we consider them part of the workforce ecosystem. And though we started this work well before OpenAI, ChatGPT, generative AI really boomed on the scene, even when we started, and now even more so, we recognize that often there are technologies. Often I tell stories about chatbots and consumers trying to interact with companies through chatbots. Those bots represent the company and are doing work for the company. They can be robots. They could be all kinds of technologies that are participating as part of the workforce. And so those we consider also to be part of the workforce. So we take this much broader, more holistic view of what's included. And David, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, so just to summarize what Liz has just identified, I mean, and it's not just like we see these folks as part of, or these entities as part of the workforce. This is what organizations and managers and executives are telling us. And it's like employees, long-term contractors, freelancers, service providers, all these circles. We were asking, we asked consistently, repeatedly of executives we spoke with, how do you think about like this as a group? All of these people as a group, if they're part of your workforce, like is some of them like closer? And the people that we spoke with had like a range of opinions about how they were conceptualizing the group. Some people thought of or spoke to concentric circles, employees in the center, long-term contractors, if you like, in the next concentric circle out, and others even further out, and you manage each circle in one way or another. And then other people talked about patchworks, and other people talked about these people are on a spectrum, which is a little bit like what structurally this graphic shows. And what we found is that they were all touching on different aspects of what a workforce ecosystem is. And like eventually we came to the idea of like we should be talking about, and they're actually talking about a workforce ecosystem. And that's how we moved to like developing this concept of a workforce ecosystem, which we'll define in a minute. We're kind of trying to build to that. But just to kind of tell you about how we got there, it wasn't just qualitative research where we spoke to executives. We've done a range. Why don't we do this one? We've done surveys of thousands and thousands of managers and companies around the world, large, small, different industry verticals. We've conducted over 100 executive interviews. And as we've talked about this idea of workforce ecosystems, which we'll get to in a second, what we've actually talked about this idea with more than 1,000 managers in different contexts. So it's pretty so the point here is it's pretty comprehensive, the research that we've done in terms of developing this idea, hearing perspectives, synthesizing perspectives. And going back to the previous slide, we've produced over, I think it's about a dozen pieces of content now, from case studies, infographics, but to articles and reports. And we have these flagship reports that are the culmination of years-long research projects, and the book that came out in April. And I apologize in advance if we keep referring to the book, but that's what new authors tend to do. So that's the research. And here, some of the key findings are, and this gets to the point that Liz was talking about, 93% of managers see external workers as part of their organization's workforce. And that's not to say that everybody in the external work, in any external contributor is part of the workforce, but a virtual consensus believes that at least some external workers are part of their workforce. At the same time, 3/4 of folks say that, and these are managers in like large companies and small companies. It's a big representative sample. Say like it's really it's crucial that you have effective management of external contributors. But what we also found is that only 30%, less than a third of organizations are agree that their organization is really effectively preparing for managing a workforce that includes external contributors, which means there's a real problem in terms of like how do you begin to think holistically and act in an integrated way with both your internal employees and your external contributors. And so this is a problem. And when we try to get executives to explain to us, is this a minor problem? Is it a big problem? Urine Wells from Unilever captured the zeitgeist that we were hearing, which is that it's a significant problem that goes to the heart of how these companies compete. It's one of the holy grails. We don't usually talk to executives and have them reach for medieval analogies to talk about how big of a problem the issue is or challenge it is. So based on the work that we did, we developed this idea of workforce ecosystems, and we believe this offers a very useful framework for addressing this challenge. Liz, you want to walk us through the definition?
Perfect. There we go. Okay, so we developed this definition, and because I'm a professor, I'm a little biased and wanted to make sure that we had a definition that was rigorous enough and structured enough that other academics could build off of it, but yet practical enough and useful enough that managers and leaders can use it. So we've come up with this definition. I'm going to take a few seconds to just, a few minutes maybe, just to walk through the definition, right? So we say it's a structure. We say that because so it's not an organization, it's a structure. And this group talks a lot about ecosystems. Ecosystems are governance structures. So there's a structure focused on value creation for an organization, because ultimately it is about creating value for the organization that's at the center of the ecosystem and those who are participating. It consists of complementarities and interdependencies. I'll come back to that, but that should be a very familiar phrase to anyone who likes ecosystems. And the structure encompasses actors from within the organization and beyond. We've already talked a bunch about that, working to pursue both individual and collective goals. So this is important because if one is trying to operate, manage, orchestrate a workforce ecosystem and only paying attention to the goals of the central organization, then it will not be sustainable, because those individuals who are working in the ecosystem and those organizations all have their own goals. And so this notion of having both mutual goals and also individual goals is really important. Let me go back to complementarities and interdependencies for a moment. Complementarities is back to the conversation I was having before, or that I mentioned about applications. So if an app developer is working independently, not a supplier, not a subsidiary, but they're working independently, they develop an app and it adds value to the same customer together with the primary product or service, that's a complementarity. So it basically means that members of the ecosystem are working independently, yet together. Right? And interdependencies means that members of the ecosystem either succeed or fail together. They basically need each other to succeed. And the reason that we include this interdependency topic and complementarities is because this is what makes it truly an ecosystem. Not that it's just a buzzword, although it seems to be very popular, but that it differentiates this from an alliance or a team or a group. But it specifically is an ecosystem because of these properties. So we came up with this definition, and then we said, okay, this exists. Now the question is, what should managers do about it, right? And we came up with an orchestration framework. And we said, okay, let's try to capture in one graphic what we think are the key themes and who are the key stakeholders. So as I often say, this hexagon started as a circle as we were discussing it. And at one point it was an octagon. And then we have now landed on a hexagon because we think this captures kind of the key points. I will also say, so, and around the outside are the key groups that contribute to orchestrating workforce ecosystems. Inevitably, there will be someone from marketing or R&D or a group that says, why are we not there? Not to say that if the groups aren't there, that we don't love them and don't think they're important. Just to say, these are the groups that came up as the first that get discussed when we're discussing this topic. So let me walk through it for a second. There are essentially, so there are concentric hexagons that are themes that I'll get to in a moment. And there are essentially three axes. I think you can see my cursor. There's one that's vertical that goes through the middle, and essentially the hexagon rotates around that. And that highlights the role of senior leaders and business unit leaders because, again, we think this is a very integrated cross-functional activity. It is no longer about marketing going out and getting people, or IT going out and getting people, or HR being responsible for all the people in an organization. To that point, this axis across the top horizontal one is human resources and procurement, because we often now are getting into these conversations essentially about jurisdiction. Who is responsible for the people in the organization? And if many of them are contractors, often those contracts are getting negotiated and managed by procurement. So that's why we have human resources and procurement there. And then IT, finance, and legal are functions that really enable the managing of these systems. So in terms of the hexagons, again, there's a nested set of them. As I was explaining to some people yesterday, we've had many discussions about which should be where. And depending on who you are, you may say, no, technology shouldn't be a hexagon. It should just be the whole box. It should be outside because it covers everything. Or if you're into leadership, you'll say, no, leadership should span all of them. And I will just say that we've needed to, and we've wanted to, highlight these different topics. So for example, management practices are things like performance management, compensation, talent acquisition, career planning, topics that often start in HR, but again, span other areas. And what this internal hexagon represents is the actual tactics, the practicalities of what needs to change when you're operating in an ecosystem environment. The next one is technology enablers. We don't have time to go through it here, but we've put forth a framework of technologies, or a typology, where we've said there's work tech, there's workforce tech, there's workplace tech, there's also credentialization and verification technologies. How do you prove, if you're a worker, that you are who you say you are and you've done what you say you've done? And if you're an organization, how do you verify that the people you're bringing into your organization are who you think they are and can do what you think they can do? And especially if you're doing this relatively quickly, you don't want to take 3-4 weeks to do that type of a verification. So using blockchain, NFTs, and other types of technologies, there are more and more of these systems helping with verification and credentialization. And then the fifth one is technology as a participant. This is where AI comes in again, and automation and other types of technologies, so those are the fifth type of technology. And again, we think it's an important type of technology. The next hexagon is integrated architectures. Integration architectures essentially means coordination. It's how do you coordinate the various players, both internally and from the internal organization to the other participants. And then the final most external hexagon is leadership approaches. And essentially we've said, look, when leaders are trying to marshal groups of people who aren't all working for the same company, it changes how they need to think about leadership. You're no longer in a traditional bureaucratic command and control type of a situation. And thus, and one of the big issues is you do essentially lose control, or you lose the direct control. And so what does that mean for management, for leadership? And often it means a much more mission-driven, purpose-driven type, values-centric approach to leadership. And we're just starting to look through that. So that is our overall orchestration framework. And in our book and in some of our articles, we dig more deeply into each of the hexagons and each of the roles. So finally, let me just share that the way the book is structured is very similar to the way we've discussed this. Part 1 introduces workforce ecosystems. Why should people care? What is driving them? What are they? Part 2 is how do you orchestrate them? And part 3 is, I think, a really important part of the book. David really led the development of this part, which is developing socially responsible workforce ecosystems. So this starts to address ethical issues, regulatory issues, all of these implications of the fact that we're seeing more and more of these structures becoming increasingly more prevalent. And with that, I will hand it back to you, David, to bring us home with a few more key points.
Thanks, Liz. So one of the things where we're at right now with the research is we're now thinking about and we're writing on the policy implications of the work that having more workforce ecosystems in the business landscape. And this Brookings article, Workforce Ecosystems and AI, really focuses on how there's been a policy emphasis and concern, and it was just connected with sort of the media focus on automation with AI and how it's going to replace jobs, people. It's going to wreak havoc with human capital and the labor. And there's absolutely concern for that. But once you take a workforce ecosystem lens to the labor, to the economy, to labor, you begin to see that AI is actually influencing a broad range of aspects about how work is designed, how the supply of workers takes place, how work is conducted, which includes the automation of work. But AI can be a peer, it can be an assistant, it can be a manager. And there are policy implications from all of these, which we outlined in this piece. And then there's another sort of hot topic, a sore topic for some, which is like measurement. And a lot of organizations are deploying AI to actually keep track of things that would have been impossible to keep track of before, including biometric aspects of how like heart rates and other kinds of social dimensions. And that's, if you're focused solely on automation, you're missing out on a lot of other kinds of policy implications. And I just want to sort of go back to one thing that, Liz, you were talking about, and that had to do with the hexagons and the framework. A lot of that framework was developed in response to what needs to change once you have a workforce ecosystem mindset and approach. And it captured all those categories that are displayed in those hexagons. If you went to business school a few years ago and you learned how to manage your workforce, it was like employees. It's like, here are the systems, here's the management techniques. You have to have a completely different point of view and set of practices around managing your whole workforce ecosystem. And that is part of the reason why we call it orchestrating a workforce ecosystem as opposed to managing one, because there's like less control in that endeavor. Anyway, where is that?
That leaves us at the end and ready to turn it back to Stuart to take questions from the audience, I believe.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, David. We've got people joining us from Germany, Portugal, Poland, America, Italy, and elsewhere. Please send in your questions. It strikes me that you've got research from 138 plus countries. Are there cultural differences in the way people view workforce ecosystems? Because some cultures are more inclusive and more understanding of ecosystems as a concept. Are there differences, do you think?
David, you want to start?
Sure. So I'd like to reframe the question.
I'm not sure you're allowed to do that.
Okay, we'll tackle it head on. But what it actually means to talk about culture and workforce ecosystems, it's one thing to talk about different cultures in across the geopolitical spectrum, and it's another one to talk about sort of cultures within the organization. Every organization has multiple cultures going on at a given time. It gets more complicated when that's spread across geographies. And it gets even more complicated when you throw in remote work where you have different kinds of culture things. One of the aspects that we get into in the book is around, and this kind of cuts through things, is reductionist in the sense of talking about one cultural issue, is to what extent do you want your workforce ecosystem to be transactional versus community-based? And it's one thing to have, let's bring everybody who's an employee is part of the corporate family, and other people who are external, they're not part of the family, but they're like welcome guests. But we're just going to treat them as people we just pay, and they're totally replaceable and disposable. So you have kind of two types of community approaches. One is family, and the other one is totally pay oriented. That distinction applies. And then there are other organizations, and we've talked to some, that say everybody is part of our corporate family, and we want everyone to feel welcome. We want everyone to feel a sense of belonging. And I think one of the cultural differences, one of the really big cultural differences with big management implications, is around this community versus transactional dimension. And I know that doesn't totally answer. I'm not going to say Japan is one way, US is another way, and there's no monolithic approach to culture.
One quick point I would add, Stuart, and it's related to your question, but slightly different. But I think we can hit it now, which is that because this is multicultural worldwide research, one thing that varies dramatically, in addition to national culture, is national labor law, and even within states and within regions. And so in many cases, and someone again yesterday at a presentation I gave said, isn't it the elephant in the room that labor laws vary by geography? And so we say, yes, they do. And even as David said, even if you're within one company, if you're Unilever or you're Novartis or you're whomever, you need to understand the labor laws across the world in the jurisdictions in which you're operating. But it doesn't mean that you don't have different ways that you can orchestrate a workforce ecosystem around to what extent you want to have the culture be tighter or weaker, basically, right? So more diverse in terms of how you treat different types of employees versus trying to be more homogenous in how you do so. And so I think there are a number of different layers to this question and this conversation.
Yeah, Dean Miles, who's joined us from Texas, talks about the complexity. I mean, there is an inherent complexity in talking about workforce ecosystems. I mean, your diagram was a pentagon or an octagon, whatever it was. Not a neat line. It doesn't have that neatness about it. So it's people's appetite for that complexity is the question.
So, right. And one of the reasons why I think it's so great and is really fun is that, as a researcher at least, and, nightmarish as a manager and leader, probably a little bit, is that, is this complexity, right? And that, it's hard enough to manage within an organization where you have some more sense of control to some extent on the policies you set, et cetera. As soon as you get into ecosystems of any sort, right? I mean, again, this whole alliance is about business ecosystems. You add levels of complexity because of the interdependencies, because of the interconnectedness and the network nature of them, right? And so now you take that complexity that you see in business ecosystems and you add to it this conversation about individuals, DE&I, labor laws, different regions, and it adds yet another sense. And that again leads to, David has spoken a lot about social responsibility, social safety nets, ethics, which also brings a whole other set of questions.
What kind of response do you get from people in HR when you present the ideas about workforce ecosystems?
It's really interesting, and some of the leaders that we've spoken with at Unilever, Novartis, and others, they get it. They are already seeing, like, Chief
Cisco.
Oh, absolutely, Cisco.
Roche, Ceridian, Dell.
They're struggling. They see the importance of bringing together in a unified way or more integrated way the external and the internal parts of the workforce ecosystem, and they're looking for best practices, for tools and sort of approaches for handling this. For HR, for procurement, there's a little leeriness because they may be asked to work in cross-functional teams where they lose power over their remit changes. Organizations that seem to be doing workforce ecosystems well or are tilting in that direction, they're developing cross-functional teams to steering committees to manage this complexity. And it is absolutely complex, but the complexity should not be a barrier to grappling with it.
Well, and we see, I think, some of the most forward-thinking organizations around these topics, for example, also have renamed HR into people and culture, and other topics like that. And so I think that's one way of signaling to their organization and externally to their partners and other contributors that that this is about building a broader look at how to address people and culture. And as David said, I think in some cases, HR is really gaining much more of a broader purview of all the different parts of the contributors. And in some cases, they're concerned that others are gaining that as well.
Yeah, the chief people officer, I have a thing with the chief people officer role, because sometimes here's a more human way of dealing with the employees in our organization, but that role still doesn't connect with the external contributors. That's beginning to change, but it hasn't changed. We spoke to one chief people officer role, and I said, like, how do you manage like, does your remit include external contributors? And she said, no, we have a chief talent person for that. We call that's talent. And I said, but these are the people. This was a platform company. And I said, these are the people who, like, you built your business around. And I said, no, I know, but the chief people officer role is a very HR centric kind of employee focused role. That's how it's developed in our company. I said, but you're calling the chief people officer, but the people who are chiefly responsible for your business outcomes are not part of your remit. I don't get the language, the semantic implication. It was a very entertaining interview at that. was.
Well, perhaps there should be a chief ecosystem officer. And where does this leave traditional functions? I mean, the way you laid out in your diagram, you still had procurement, IT, and so on, but that kind of stands out as somehow it doesn't quite fit in, does it?
Well, so I would not take our diagram in any way as kind of a new organizational structure, right? So it's a framework to help think about, what are the roles of these different pieces, right? I think there is a question. So if we did a nice piece, I think, on Cisco, and we had great interactions with Cisco, and they have put in place a cross-functional steering committee to deal with their contingent workforce strategy and implementing it. And in that case, the functions still exist very much as the functions, but they come together to discuss this topic, in that case, specifically about contingent strategy, contingent workforce. So it's not the entire workforce ecosystem. So for example, it doesn't include complementers or technologies, but yet it's a very high level cross-functional steering committee. So I think we're seeing more and more of this matrixed kind of approaches and cross-functional kinds of approaches. It's an interesting question longer term, what implications it might have for the actual functions. For the moment, I think there's less dramatic change. At least we're not hearing about huge dramatic change in terms of functions, but more in terms of how the functions are coordinating, collaborating, managing. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing other stories and other examples from other companies, but at least that's been my experience thus far.
Yeah, when the composition and boundaries of the workforce shift, which is what the workforce ecosystems work that we've done shows, is not the composition isn't just employees. The boundaries are not just within the organization. When that shifts, so too does the boundaries between the functions of the organization shift as well. There needs to be more collaboration, more cross-functional coordination in order to orchestrate the workforce ecosystem. That's one of the key messages.
One thing that struck me is that workforce ecosystems have always existed.
That's right.
But just haven't been described in that way or identified.
So two things. I think they haven't been described that way. And I think that today's technologies have them happening at a much larger scale and much more prevalence. So I thought about this when we were starting also, especially saying, I was at Motorola for 18 years. We always had contractors. They were a part of our business, right? So that's not new. But if I think about the percentages, how many of the people, it was nowhere near what we're seeing now in terms of Unilever having 100,000 employees and 50,000 contingent workforce, right? Cisco having 80,000 employees and 50,000 contingent. So I think the numbers, so that's the scale is different. I also think because of technology, because of the software centricity of many services and products, you end up with APIs, you end up with modularity, you end up with complementers able to contribute to value in a way that the world used to have much simpler, more standalone products. Today's products are much more complex by and large. And so you have many more contributors. The same way, again, that's why we see much more interest in business ecosystems overall. And I think this is an extension of that trend that you're seeing. And I think it is also, again, cross-industry in that all industries are dealing with technological change affecting their industry, whether or not they're a tech industry or not. And so then that builds into this question. So, I mean, if you look at generative AI and how it's going to affect different industries and how it's going to affect how people do work in those industries and other forms of AI for that matter, then it helps you think about, these interdependencies, this framework or this lens of a workforce ecosystem is going to increasingly make sense as a way to think about these structures.
Yeah, language is really important in this area. And one word you use is orchestration.
That's right.
Which is a really nice word. What does it mean in practice? What do you see when you talk about orchestration? What are you thinking of?
David, do you want me to?
You want to talk about jazz?
We can always talk about jazz.
Sure. Okay. So, and this actually came from, I think it was the book Reed Hastings co-authored, and I'm now forgetting the co-author, unfortunately.
Erin Meyer.
Exactly. Thank you. So I wrote an academic paper with Mike Tushman and Frank Nagel, and we talked about shepherding ecosystems. I still like the notion of shepherding, but it's not quite as catchy, and it's a little bit harder for a number of reasons. So we then started talking about orchestrating ecosystems, which other scholars and researchers and consultants are talking about. But I was still having a problem with it because we were still having a problem because musicians in a traditional orchestra have a prescribed set of what they need to do. They don't have a lot of agency and autonomy. They do to some extent, but there's still pretty defined roles that they need to stay within. However, if you take orchestration more broadly, if you're orchestrating a jazz ensemble, for example, the musicians have much more agency, much more freedom to improvise, to do what they do, but in a way that comes together still in an excellent composition together. And so we think of this orchestration a little more as orchestrating in the context of jazz than classical music. But yet we still think it's more than it's different than managing because of the agency of the various contributors.
David, and the lack of control. Yeah. And the lack of control.
Yeah. Right. And so that's why we're moving more towards orchestration than managing, because we've been talking about influence without authority for a zillion years. And we think this is, again, an extension of that. It's this notion of pulling together, shepherding, orchestrating. When you don't have direct control, you don't have the perks of compensation and promotions you might traditionally have, but yet you still want to pull the group together in a meaningful way to create value.
Yeah, it's really interesting. C.K. Prahalad talked about shepherding related to leadership, which was
that's right.
Interesting as well. Yeah, I think the notion of shepherding is good. Yeah, and the entire idea of the kind of workforce is one of those old-fashioned words, isn't it? I was thinking as you were explaining work and the combination with ecosystems. Workforce seems to me a kind of an old-fashioned word combined with ecosystems.
Well, this again is why when David first called, I kind of said I'm not interested, frankly, because I thought, like, I'm dealing with platforms and ecosystems. Why would I want to go study workforces as a workforce, really, frankly, to start with? And then we started talking about it, and then David was incredibly persuasive also to say, no, the world is changing, and what is a workforce is changing. And thus the way we think about workforces have to change. And that's why, again, even the first interviews, I was so surprised and excited to hear, because as we spoke with very senior people, I remember the conversation with Donna Morris at Walmart and others. I said, how do you think about workforce? And again, I really thought they were going to say, like, I don't know, the people work for us, and not, employees. Or instead, it just immediately, like, oh, this is a problem. This is interesting. We've been discussing it. I was in a meeting about this morning, and you just realize that this is a hot topic.
It wasn't.
It's hot because people need to address it. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, no. It's the people we spoke with, like, almost unanimously started talking about, it's not the employment arrangement that defines whether or not they are part of our workforce. It's whether they're contributing to the outcomes, whether they're creating value for us. And for them, it wasn't just a semantic shift. This was like a metaphysical change in how they were thinking about their workforce. This was because it's not just like in the US, sorry for this sort of US focus, but it's not just the W-2 or permanent thing that defines whether or not you're part of the workforce. It's like, you can't have like a family or a community oriented approach to your workforce ecosystem if it's defined by employment arrangement. If like you're, whether or not you're part of the workforce,
like tax code.
Yeah. If tax code is defining it, and not like human agency and your contribution outcomes. That's
right. It's problematic.
Yeah.
So even if you're the guy who bangs the drum once, 27 minutes into the symphony, you're part of the workforce ecosystem.
Well, that's
right.
that's an interesting point that we get into, that we touch on in the book, and because I've kind of struggled with that myself. Is like, well, like, come on, really? They're going to be part of the workforce? But there's a difference between inclusiveness defined in terms of like making people feel like they belong to the organization. Because the person who bangs the drum once, they're not going to feel like they belong. But really, the fundamental point is to make people feel welcome. And the difference between encouraging welcomeness versus belonging is kind of creates more opportunities to bring people in.
That's a nice idea, isn't it? Making people welcome would be a step forward for many organizations.
Yeah.
Liz, David, we're out of time. Unfortunately, it's really interesting debate. Workforce Ecosystems, a great book. We strongly recommend it. If people would like to find out more about your work, Liz, David, where'd they look online?
So go ahead, Liz.
So MIT Press, especially, so if you're in the United States, Amazon, MIT Press, etc. If you're outside of the United States, if you go to the MIT Press website and you type in workforce ecosystems, there will be a bunch of gray boxes, and those gray boxes actually change depending on where you are to find the most relevant place for you to click on to purchase it. So for the book, that's the way to do it. I would say, David, if you want to explain, at SMR, it's Loan Management Review, I'll just say we have a landing page. If you look under Future of the Workforce, and all of our infographics, so the kind of easier to access infographics, short articles, research reports, interactive data system that you can mess with our data, that's all on a homepage that's called The Future of the Workforce, and it's hosted on the MIT Loan Management Review website, and that's open to anybody who wants to see it.
Brilliant. I'm sure people will seek it out. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, David. On July the 14th, we'll be holding our next BEA webinar featuring Marshall Van Alstyne, Elisa Fari, Paolo Savini, and Delia Wada-Gill on how to measure network effects. And then on 19th of July, Andrea Cates will join us to explore the world of high-impact ecosystems. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon. And thank you to Liz and David. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.